It takes very little observational skills to look around and see how human society is slowly falling. Right now, we live in a time to where depression is on a worldwide scale. Right, we have, as far as we know, some of the greatest technology that humans have ever had access to, so far as we know. But on the other side of things, we've never seen this level of chronic depression spread across society anywhere in history. At least I can't think of a single time period anywhere that humankind was generally at the lowest possible psychological point. Looking around, it's insane how humans have been able to get to this level of psychology and not fight back against it. Now, what the hell does this have to do with catastrophism, and how does something like this possibly prove that catastrophism is real? Now, we have a lot of problems when we look around at humanity today. And there's a lot that we can talk about, and some, interestingly enough, that we are not allowed to talk about. In fact, the fact that we cannot discuss certain objective topics that everybody on the planet is currently dealing with, and I mean everybody, it doesn't matter what religion, race, country, it doesn't matter. If you are a human on this planet, you are having to deal with this, but you're not allowed to talk about it. All right, so I'm not going to get into certain points because that will probably immediately get this channel banned. But what we can do is we can go over certain other points that are backed up by real science and real observation, not only from, researchers and scientists that you can read about, but also yourself. And I think that's one of the most important aspects of science that we have, is that when you yourself can look around and observe whatever the hell's going on and come to your own conclusion using observational evidence that you personally have. In my opinion, one of the things that has been stripped away from basically all humans, or almost all humans, in today's day and age is your independent agency. A lot of people nowadays, they don't understand that they themselves can be the discoverer of something new, that they themselves can look around and make legit observations and come to brand new conclusions that might go against what the status quo is currently, shilling at the moment. This is important because people have nowadays been trained to no longer think that they can think for themselves. One of the main things that has been conditioned out of general society is critical thinking skills. Right? For example, every single year in grade school, all the way throughout really your entire life, if you were in school, you should have been being taught about critical thinking. Like, it should have been a direct focus. How many people can say they got, say, 12, 14 years worth of direct critical thinking training in their, mainstream society curriculums? And I guarantee you it's none of you, right? Unless you went to some sort of special school that for whatever reason decided to focus on that. The reality is the vast majority of the planet's population is never received any training when it comes to critical thinking. Right? Those skills are skills. Critical thinking is not just something that all humans have inherently and are perfect at. Right? Critical thinking is just like playing a sport, or it's just like playing piano or something like that, right? You have got to use that skill to get better at it. And if that skill is not trained from an early age on, biologically, it just gets more and more difficult to learn the new skill, right? One of the reasons why I believe that people don't really think about critical thinking as a critical skill is because everybody just kind of assumes if you are a human, you can critically think and you will just do it on your own and it'll just work perfectly and you don't have to practice or anything like that. Right? That is not the case at all. And look around. We have scientific evidence now that we can say proves that statement, that critical thinking is no longer present in any real capacity in today's science or in today's society in general. Right? That's gone now. So when I say your observation is important, you might just write that off as like, oh yeah, I observe things, but do you really observe things? Are you really looking around at your environment and taking a fresh perspective and asking good questions, good scientific questions, and then seeking out answers for those questions. The reality is most people aren't doing this. Most people will say, of course I do that. But that I guarantee you, if I get them one-on-one for just a couple of minutes, we can call out all the stuff that they are missing, and they will immediately go thinking about themselves as this high-level intellectual god to, a low-level kindergartner that doesn't know anything. Now that's on the extreme side of things, but that's the reality. I suffer the exact same problem. Right? I didn't get critical thinking skills when I started when I was 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, for example. That was not in my curriculum. To make matters worse, in our society today, critical thinking is not encouraged. In fact, especially if you live in a Western environment, and especially if you are in mainstream academia, they literally tell you to not do your own research, right? Trust the science. People are not even allowed to ask basic common sense questions, which is the other point, that even common sense has been psychologically conditioned out of our population. And it's getting worse every generation, right? Or you could say it's getting worse every year. And technology is, of course, not helping, or at least it's not helping like us, the normal people. It is certainly helping those along who are able to exploit it on a global scale. Now, I know this is going to sound all conspiracy theory, and you're just crazy and all of that. We're not going to go crazy with that stuff. In fact, we're going to stop there. I'm not going to go crazy with that. But I wanted to point out that this is the environment, scientifically, that we live in. Right? The cases I just made are not based off of some schizo rant. I can scientifically prove that the human population is not operating at the height of its intellectual capability. Right? Now, we can do that. And it's funny, if I were to truly do that, if I were to truly go off and show you all the scientific evidence, this channel would be banned. That fact in and of itself is really all the proof that we need that real science is not being done in the mainstream. And it certainly is not cherished in mainstream Western society. Right? That's scientific evidence right there. Whether you want to admit that or not, that's not my problem, right? If the evidence is there. Remember, science does not care about your feelings. And a lot of people nowadays don't want to hear that. A lot of people, they operate on their feelings. And why? Because they've been socially engineered to do that. I mean, that's literally why they do it. Instead of using common sense, instead of stopping and looking around in your environment and making better decisions, asking good questions, you don't do that anymore. You operate on your emotions because you've been engineered to do that. And that's a scientific fact. There's no arguing with me on that. Sorry. This is science. We don't care about feelings, we want science. Now, okay, so what the hell does any of this have to do with catastrophism? The reason why I wanted to lay a little bit of foundational groundwork there, painting the picture of what we are currently going through right now, all of us alive right now. We can look around and we can see how things are going. Now, I was talking about social engineering and stuff like that. That's a big chunk of it, but there's a lot of other evidence that I want to bring to light with respect to how we live nowadays that may inevitably prove that massive catastrophes hit humankind in very recent history. And by recent history, I am not talking like 100,000 years ago or 1,000,000 years ago. Like right now, one of the examples we'll go over is that there in the mainstream, if you go look at all the garbage search engines, you'll see, oh yeah, about 90,000 years ago, something really bad happened to humans, but it was 90,000 years ago, and so we really don't have to prove anything because it was so long ago, but just believe us. Here's our quasi-evidence that we're showing you that we've interpreted this way. Don't question it. Don't think for yourself. Just believe that date, and that's what you're going to find. You're going to find stuff like that, and we'll talk more about mainstream trash cover-ups like that. And that's a scientific cover-up. That's not real science, right? When you go look at that kind of a situation and you really ask the questions and you apply critical thinking skills to these statements that the mainstream gives, right, their conclusions are a joke. The answer that they come to is literally an insult to humans everywhere. I mean, it's an insult to your intelligence. It's an insult to the scientific method. It's just all around corrupt and bad. Now, this also will help us prove that catastrophism is real as well. All right, so let's get down to it. Why does any of this matter? So here's the deal. If we look at how humans are operating now, where do we find ourselves? Let's take a few bullet points of data, and we could realistically add hundreds, but we are just going to cover a few bigger ones, because that's really all we need to paint the picture and to kind of prove that this is a legit claim that catastrophism happened and wiped out humans multiple times just in the past few thousand years, right? Few thousand, 10,000, 15,000 years ago. Which brings us to the premise of the claim. So catastrophism right now claims that the Earth has gone through a series of absolutely planet-altering destruction only in the past, thousands of years in human memory. And the main point about this is that this stuff has happened within human memory. I know I'm repeating myself, but from a span from about, you could really argue about from 1,000 years ago, where we had our last quote-unquote catastrophe. It wasn't as horrible, but it still messed stuff up pretty good. All the way back to like 10 to 15,000 years ago, where we have really the beginning of what brings us to where we are now, that huge catastrophism. And for those of you who care, and I don't want to scare off other people, but that catastrophism, you would know it as the deluge, right? You would know that as the flood. So for you atheists, hold on. I'm not saying God did anything. There's no God here. I don't believe in God. There's none of that, so stick around. There is merit to the deluge, and I'm not going to go into the deluge here. I'm just saying that's the first and the beginning catastrophe that starts everything off. That situation, right? And for those of you who have been listening, that would have been during a time where Earth orbited a proto-Saturnian red dwarf in a southern axial situation. We'll talk about that stuff later. Anyway, it's not relative to here. What I want to discuss is I want to look around and use critical thinking skills that we've been trying to practice, right? You've been practicing every day. You've been trying to get better. That's the goal. That is what we need to do. The idea here is to look around at our current surroundings and see what kind of information and evidence can we gather from us alive right now. And I mean, look out your door. Use your experiences, your imperial experiences. Like, you go look and use your observational data that you see every day in your life, right? This is real science. You can do this. Observational data is fantastic, and that is what we are going to use. So what I want to do is I want to use what we have right now, your average person. We don't need a super collider. We don't need a microscope. We don't need anything. I just need you and your eyeballs, or your senses. I need you and your senses. So that's the beauty about this, actually, is being able to do science, real science, using our senses, asking good questions, and then critically thinking about those questions to see what we can find. Now, when we look around at Earth right now, human-wise, the human population is in a very particular and unique state in history. What I mean by that is, and I opened it up with it, right now, we have a planet with billions of people on the planet. Now, I don't know what the exact number is. Last time I saw it was like 8 or something billion people. That's a lot of people. That is a lot of people. Scientifically speaking, humans need a chunk of resources to exist. And humans, of course, also, as they advance, we have scientific evidence that humans just use more resources, right? There's whole groups trying to stop humans from using resources. This is a scientific observable fact. Generally, human society wants more and more, and that's a lot of people. That's not every single society, by the way. There are absolutely societies out there who, they try not to do that. But I'm talking in general. On the aggregate, there is an uptick constantly right now, or we see that graph bar going up, of resource consumption. Now, we know that resources aren't infinite. That's why groups exist that try to stop humans from using all the resources, right? But we live in a world now to where we have 8, 9, 10 billion people, and they are consuming resources at an extraordinary rate. Now, before you start thinking I'm going to get all hippie with you or anything like that, not at all. This is just a factual observation. What I just made is a factual statement. And that is something that we could technically plot, right? I talked about a graph for a second. If we were to graph it, you would see the consumption rates of all kinds of resources. It just trends upwards. Now you can't use something forever, right? So this is a scientific problem. And we know it's a problem. But what we have now, though, is that we have 8, 9, 10 billion people on the planet. This is the very first interesting point that we can look at that will help us prove catastrophism is real. And then from here, we'll scale it out from there. I think, yeah, this will be a good foundation. So if we look back in history, when we start to look at genetic studies, we start to look at DNA patterns, and we try to see the migrations of peoples and stuff like that. First of all, that stuff is difficult. I know it. I know the mainstream makes it sound like they have all of these migration patterns locked down. They know exactly where all these different people were at, like all the time throughout history. That is all lies and garbage. We don't know any of that. That is all at best guesswork. Remember that we don't have the true evidence for that stuff. And in fact, a lot of people might be saying, well, I know the migration of my ancestors. I guarantee you have no idea if you have not factored in plasma physics, electric universe, and catastrophism. You have nothing, I guarantee it. It's impossible because you are not listening to your ancestors' history. Those of you who have listened to your ancestors' history and agree with what they have been trying to communicate down to you throughout the generations, you are on a better foundational platform for having the truth than any geneticist that we know of. Right? It's hilarious, and we'll do a show on that one day, probably too. All right, so if we have 8, 9, 10 billion people on this earth today, what does that bullet point tell us? This is a raw number. Right? And like I said, I don't know the exact number, but it's billions. We have that number around, right? And I don't know when you're going to be listening to this. And nobody has the true number anyways, right? That's another scientific fact. Nobody knows the exact number of humans on this planet. We don't know, right? We have a really good idea that it's high billions, or I should say, 8, 9, 10 billion, wherever like that. That's a lot, right? We can say that, and we can say that with relative certainty. But we don't know the exact number, and that matters too. But we can safely say 8, 9, 10 billion. Okay. So if we have 8, 9, 10 billion people on this planet, the next question is that we can ask, and it's a good question, is how? How did we end up with so many people, right? If humans have been around like mainstream, by the way, claims that humans in their general form now, you and me, me, everybody who ever exists nowadays, humans have been in this particular iteration for about 100,000 years. That is what anthropologists will generally feel comfortable telling you, right? And of course the dates can range from even further back, maybe push it a little closer. I'm just going off what the kind of mainstream consensus is there. I'm not even going to get into alternative yet. Real history. We're not there yet. So what the claim then is that humans have been around, like you and me, with our same capabilities intellectually, physically, our same drives, the same kinds of possibilities biologically. 100,000 years, and we do nothing up until about 5,000 years ago. 6, maybe 10. I'll give them 10. I'll give you 10,000. 90,000 years, and humans, like you and me, do nothing but scratch our butt. Just nothing. We apparently walked around, hiding in caves, banging on things with a club, and not understanding the wheel or fire. Let me ask you a question. Do you honestly believe, and I mean you, not anybody else, do you honestly believe that you would never understand the concept of a wheel by the time you're probably like 4 years old? Do you honestly believe you would be so stupid as to not look at a rock, roll it, and be like, oh, hey, that's cool. We can probably do something with that. Right? If you're a human, you have the concept of the wheel. That's ridiculous, right? So basically, for 90,000 years, humans did nothing. They couldn't even figure out the wheel, right? No, of course not. That is not how that operates, right? That date is ridiculous. But the other thing that's a side note. That's a side thing. Okay. But, you know, it's just something to think about, right? The fact that mainstream likes to say that we're just that dumb for that long and not doing, and I mean, literally no progression. No progression whatsoever. The best we could do was some cave art, apparently. That's it. That's it. We were able to chisel some stupid lines into some rock, like, you know, at the age of with the comprehensive age of a 3-year-old, and that was the best we could do for 90,000 years. And that's everybody, by the way. Everybody on the planet was operating like that. Nobody rose up. All right, so obviously not. Okay. Here's the other point that we have to make, though. So for 100,000 years, or 90, whatever, 100,000 years, the human population somehow stayed relatively small. Now, with this observation in hand, we can admit that we have a problem. Because if we look around right now at human population growth, just in the past few hundred years, the growth has been exponential. And that is how humans generally, grow. It is exponentially. But if we look at population growths right now in just the past few hundred years, we've noticed that we can go from just a few 100 million to billions in a very, very short time. Hundreds of years. At best, I'll give you maybe 1,000. It does not take that long, ultimately, for humans to procreate. And this is a scientifically observable fact. This is a fact, right? So there's nothing to dispute with me here. Humans grow exponentially. So we have a problem. We have to ask why in the past 100,000 years, humans didn't grow. We just didn't grow exponentially. In fact, even mainstream is willing to say something like there was a certain period of time within this period of time that humans were down to maybe 1,400 people for a chunk of time in our history. That's mainstream's claim, by the way, not me, not alternative research. Mainstream feels comfortable saying that there was a time period within that 100,000 years that humans dropped down to a 1,400 level population. That's what they're fine with, okay? So, okay, there's a lot there. I mean, first of all, okay, that's weird. Now, how do they make that claim? Well, the genetic evidence shows that there have been, it's good evidence. They can interpret it a little differently, but the genetic evidence shows that there are multiple eras in human history, in recent human history, that is, and this is mainstream, once again. I'm not, this is not alternative interpretation. There are multiple times here within the past 100,000 years that the human race has, for some weird reason, been absolutely decimated. All right, now, mainstream admits this, but it's not shouted from the rooftops. The reason why is because you have to figure out a way to get rid of humans. And one of the problems with that is our exponential growth. If humans are generally left alone, like we can observe now, if we are not dying by the billions, we grow pretty fast. And I'm sure right now there are those of you thinking, well, I mean, the reason why we're good now is because of our great medical conditions. People just live longer. Really? Really? That's okay, where's your evidence for that? First of all, and here's the uncomfortable truth that mainstream doesn't like to talk about, is the reality is we have no idea what the average length of life was for a human. And why don't we know that? Because we don't have any of that evidence from back in the day. For you to make a claim, for mainstream to make the claim that they know for a fact that humans had shorter lifespans, you would have to know every single human's life back in the day throughout that last 100,000 years. You would have to. Otherwise, you can't make the claim. You need to know very specifically every single human to make that calculation. Or at the very least, you have got to know like 90% of the population's lifespan. Provably. You have to be able to scientifically prove that. We have none of these bodies. We have none of these stories. We have none of this evidence. So the very first myth that we have to get rid of is that humans just died young. The average age 50,000 years ago was, 37. Or whatever. 37, you were an ancient grandpa, wise man of the tribe, banging on rocks with other, that was not happening. Okay, we have no proof of that. People don't like to admit that. The reality is that statement cannot be made scientifically. You can propose it as a hypothesis, and that's fine, But once again, you better come swinging with amazing amounts of evidence. Anthropologists have precisely zero evidence to support that claim at any real, factual, scientific level. Remember, facts and science don't care about your feelings. And these anthropologists have nothing. So, the first myth we can get rid of is the fact that humans died off really young. So that would have kept the populations down. Okay, gone. That's not true. We don't need to believe that. There's no reason to believe that. And we even have people's histories saying that that's ridiculous anyways. There's no reason to believe that. Okay, so then what's next? Well, I mean, there's the medical thing. We just, we're able to live longer because we can cure diseases and blah, 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 blah. All right, it's an interesting perspective. Let's get rid of this. There's two very easy ways to get rid of this. The very first one is that we do not have proof that all of the diseases that we suffer from now existed back then. In fact, what's really interesting about a lot of that stuff is that it seems like we have newer diseases now that our ancestors never had to deal with. This is also once again acknowledged by the mainstream. So once again, if you take a mainstream perspective, you probably believe some hypocritical things. Right, so we don't have evidence of certain diseases that would have wiped people out. Of course, you can come back and play devil's advocate and say, well, maybe there were diseases that we don't know about. And I will give that to you, and that's fine. But unless we have evidence of that mystery disease, there's no reason for me as a scientist to infer it. So I'm not going to. All right. So we can push the disease or sickness thing out of the way. There's no reason for that either. So now we have people being able to live relatively healthy lives, and please believe their lives would have been healthier than yours today. Think about that. Think about all the trash, literal trash, that you consume nowadays. And for those of you who try to avoid the trash, good on you. Keep going. I highly recommend it. I certainly try. But the reality is, our current generation, if you're alive today, the planet is absolutely saturated with the garbage, right? The planet is saturated with all of these chemicals, estrogens, chemicals, etc. in the water. Literal opioids can now be tested and found in regular ocean water. How do you like that? In certain areas of the planet. This is just a fact, right? This stuff did not exist for our ancestors in their water supplies, right? Our ancestors were living much better health-wise relative to what we do now. Right? And so they were eating better, and obviously they were physically more in shape because they had to survive. Right? Whatever they were doing, they did not have cars. They were not sitting on their cell phones or their computers all day, right? Listening to people like me blab about garbage, right? Nobody was doing that. People were working together, surviving, building societies, helping each other out, and moving life forward. That's what they would have been doing, and that kind of a lifestyle would have promoted natural health. That's just the way it goes. There's nothing to argue about, right? So humans could not, we got to get rid of the disease thing, and humans would have lived longer because they would have simply scientifically been healthier. And that's, what do you want from me? That's a fact. They don't have the problems that we have nowadays. Back to the medical thing really fast. One other thing to point out, and this is a scientific data point, so please remember, we go with science, and it doesn't matter if you like it or not. One other scientific data point that we can show relative to medical care and stuff like that. You want to say that, oh yeah, we just had better medical care now and they didn't have it back then. Here's the deal. The reality is tons of countries on this planet have zero access to what you consider first world medical care. They don't have it, and their populations are exploding. So it is unscientific to make the claim that medical technology is extending everybody's lives today, because we don't need that. The other populations, the other countries of the planet that do not have access to this stuff, scientifically prove that claim is false. So we can move on from that. Okay, so we can get rid of that. Now, once we get rid of that, then we have to ask ourselves, okay, well then, if everybody is remaining relatively healthy, relatively good, you have the potential to live a decent lifetime, and procreate, right? There was not birth control all over the place. Women were actually having babies back then and raising everybody was coming together, both men and women, and a society to be happy and raise families and to build each other up, right? That's what societies are supposed to do. You're supposed to work together as a team, take everybody's strengths together, compensate for weaknesses and move forward. Like that, we don't do that today, right? That's impossible nowadays, especially. But they would have been doing that. So they just have a general better lifestyle. All right. Okay, we'll move on. It just angers me that we don't have that now. All right, so we can get rid of no diseases. That's dumb. We don't need to infer diseases. We can bet that these people were living better lives given the scientific evidence. Check. All right. So how the hell did the populations die off? What could have possibly killed off millions of humans around the planet? Remember, it's all humans. It's not just like one group I'm talking about. This is a global problem. What the hell could have gotten rid of humans on that scale to where you could decimate populations? So we have an answer, right? In real historical studies and in real science, we have the answer. The reality is it was probably catastrophism, or it was catastrophism. Our planet has gone through hell and back in the past, 5, 6, 7, 12,000, 15,000 years or so. And we have tons of evidence to support that. But those are different shows. Right now, we just want to use our current human situation as proof that those disasters happened. Now, so we have to get rid of human populations. So what does the mainstream do? The mainstream technically has no answers. They have a lot of wild theories. They'll just throw out stuff. The reality is all of their claims ring hollow because they ultimately do not follow the scientific method and they do not have the evidence to support whatever claim they are currently making, right? And there's a bunch of them. Not too many, but they all run along the same line. Some people still try to uphold the medical thing or the disease thing or whatever. The next or the age thing, that kind of garbage. People have not let go of that. They'll hold on to that forever because they don't want to think in reality. Okay. Right, so how do you get rid of population? So for the mainstream, they have to be relegated to that stuff because the mainstream does not want to admit that large catastrophes has afflicted humanity. And they certainly don't want to admit that these large catastrophes has afflicted humanity in the past thousands of years, right? In the past 10,000 years, there's no way that they want to admit that. The main reason why they can't admit that is because the mainstream is based on the theory of uniformity. Now, the theory of uniformity, that dictates that everything happens slowly over time. And this has now been baked into every aspect of mainstream academia. It doesn't matter if it's a science or a history or whatever. Everything has to take 10 trillion years to happen. The ironic part with the theory of uniformity is that there's no real proof to think like that. Right? This is a socially programmed and engineered concept now that has been embedded into all of the mainstream academia, whatever, that it's their golden child. It's one of their main pillars of everything that they build all of their histories and sciences off of, and it is completely 100% wrong. So the mainstream can't get rid of the theory of uniformity because it's foundational, so they're stuck with it. So for them to admit that a large catastrophe or several large catastrophes happened, it's very difficult for them. And the best they could do is they can make a disease happen or something. Maybe a volcano. I see volcanoes now. A volcano erupted and destroyed the entire planet. Blah, blah, blah. Right? Okay, where's that volcano? We think it might be here, but okay, well, that's not big enough. Well, I mean, it maybe, blah, the amount of cope from the mainstream when they try to explain. I love the volcano ones. It's so funny how they blame, everything is a volcano once they can't explain it, right? Oh, volcano did it. Yeah, it pumped smoke out and then it killed everybody. Really? Yes. Anyway, dumb. So, we don't need to do that. Now, that does not mean that volcanoes did not play a role in the catastrophes. They very much did. Please believe that. But for very much other reasons that we will go into, not in this show. Anyway, So we need to prove catastrophism, right? We have to get rid of this. The population growth of humanity is a huge indicator that we have suffered cataclysmic destruction in the past few thousand years. Here's the reasoning why. Humans progress exponentially. If humans are going to progress exponentially and then suddenly die off, you have got to figure out a way to get rid of them. Mainstream has nothing but cope answers. I mean, the good news about the mainstream is at least some of them are at least admitting to looking at a comet, right? They'll kind of now look at comets and be like, well, maybe a comet did it. And that's where it dies, right? They just say, maybe a comet did it, and then they move on. They don't want to discuss it any further, because even entering into the discussion about the possibility of a comet, well, that gets into all the problems with cosmology and all of those issues. I mean, comets are a huge deal, or a huge problem for the mainstream, right? They think that they're dirty snowballs still, even though the landers landed there and found nothing but rock and very, very little water, by the way. And that's NASA, right? It's okay. All right. Get my point. But that's as far as they're willing to go, and then they drop it, right? They'll be like, well, we're going to find more evidence later. And we've been waiting forever, and they have nothing. In fact, if you want to go see a good comedy, go read some of the articles or something while these cosmologists cope with all the new data that completely destroys like their commentary point of view. Or the James Webb Telescope one right now is the best one. It is absolutely proving the Big Bang is dumb and stupid and never happened. And they're trying to figure out like, anyway. It's funny. Go entertain yourself. I highly advise it. Okay. Anyway, so what we can see is that right now, okay, let's come back to our present time. I know I'm rambling. I'll get to the point. All right. So if we look now at our present time, we have billions of people on this planet. We know for a fact that these billions of people, it's a relatively new phenomenon, right? Only in the past 1,000, 2,000 years have we really been building up to this point. Now, this is important. That means that something guaranteed had to happen multiple times to get rid of humans and to stop us from progressing population-wise. Not only that, but we know that once humans start to progress and start to, exponentially grow, right? We know that inventions are going to start popping up. We know that humans are going to be building societies. They're going to be trending towards technology naturally. That is just naturally what humans do for whatever reason, right? That's a whole other show. But that's what humans do, and they do that naturally, right? It doesn't matter. You can leave a human alone, and humans will start to invent things to survive. And that's what they do. So as populations grow, we have to start consuming resources, things get better, logistics chains grow, etc., etc. In the past, we have zero evidence of any kind of a society that exists like ours today. So what that tells us is that throughout history, humans have never operated population-wise at this level. What that proves is that the mainstream concept of 100,000 years ago humans starting is wrong. It has to be wrong. We know that for a fact. The next part is that we have to start clearing out humans, right? If we know it only takes a few thousand years for humans to exponentially grow population-wise, that means the last catastrophe couldn't have happened more than a couple thousand years ago. And sure enough, the last main catastrophe that we know of would have been the Mars event, right? The one previous to that, 1,000 years before that, was the Venus event. And then, of course, the one previous to that would have been the deluge. And that doesn't mean that other cataclysms didn't happen in between. Smaller ones, still incredibly destructive. In fact, we guarantee that happened. We know for a fact that stuff happened. But what we can start to see by looking at humanity today is that if humanity goes unslaughtered, right? If humanity is not being slaughtered by cataclysms en masse, then this is where we end up. And we have no other point in human history that has ever been like we are today. Now, I'm just talking at population numbers in and of themselves. And that science is telling, and it's there, right? We have no evidence for humans being able to exponentially grow. And the reason why is because something had to stop them. Good news. Our ancestors told us what happened. Our ancestors' histories are full of these absolutely earth-crushing, human-killing catastrophes. And they've been transmitted down to us over the millennia. Just because the mainstream ignores it doesn't mean everybody has to, right? If we take those histories as fact, then suddenly the human situation starts to make more sense. So catastrophism, if you can say catastrophism is garbage, it never happened, these things are impossible, but the reality is the human population right now proves unequivocally that catastrophism is real and that humans absolutely suffered huge catastrophes in recent memory, and our ancestors recorded it. Now, let's go to another interesting piece of evidence. So right now, we have not suffered a major cataclysm in at least like 1,000, 1,500 years or so. And even the one that happened 1,500 to 1,000 years ago, it was big enough to annihilate a chunk of the planet, a very particular section. But it wasn't the world. Like, the whole world didn't suffer. People survived it well enough. And while I won't get into it, that catastrophe would have been the crises that mainstream knows in the first millennia as the first century crisis, the third century crisis, and I believe it's the 9th century crisis. It's something like that. They have this 1,000 years that never existed from 0 AD to 1000 AD. There's no such thing as that. It's all one crisis. It's one catastrophe that struck the earth during that period of time. And there'll be another show on that later. We have all kinds of stuff to talk about for that. But even that catastrophe, it only affected a part of the world, and it didn't take out, even though it took stuff out and it did change stuff, the majority of the world survived it, right? So the population continued to grow. That means that the main last catastrophe that we suffered would have been the Mars catastrophe, when Mars made its final pass by of Earth, when the planetary system was still trying to find its equilibrium after the dissemination of the Saturnian configuration. Right, so that Mars catastrophe definitely screwed humans up pretty damn good worldwide. But that was the last one. So, we could say 2,000, 2,500 years ago or so was the last major catastrophe, which means that humans have been able to procreate and expand for about that long of time. So it doesn't take that long for humans to go from very little to billions, right? One of the other things that we don't find in history either is that we do not find humans being depressed at the level that humans are depressed today. We have no time in history to where people are suffering psychologically, as far as we can tell, the way that people are suffering today. Now, what does that mean? Why do I even bring that up? So when we look at society today, we find that a large portion of the population, and maybe, I don't know, kind of everybody to one degree or another, I mean, you're going to be at least be affected by this somewhat because you exist right now. All right, a huge chunk of the population feels like they have no purpose. There's nowhere to go. There's nothing to do. There's no point. Right? I mean, and this is a real psychological problem. Now, there's two reasons why this problem is appearing. The first reason is that, unfortunately, yes, we do have psychological conditioning tactics going on right now that support and promote this kind of thinking, right? This is unfortunate, but it's happening, and I won't go any further than that. The other side of things is that we know, scientifically speaking, that if there's too many humans now, people lose purpose because you lose the value of being a human. So what we find is on a global scale, people being depressed, right? And to make things even worse, we have a power structure that very much fuels that depression. So, but you don't even need that power structure to fuel that depression. The reality is, once humans start to feel that they have no value, they will fall into a dark spiral of depression. And it goes deeper and it gets crazier. I'm not going to spend too much time going into all of that. It's a whole 10 other shows. But this is what happens. Now, why does this matter? How does this help prove that catastrophism happened? Well, if we're going to go back to the mainstream claim that humans have been around for 100,000 years, which we've already disproven, but let's disprove it more using science, right? Humans would have had an opportunity to expand, right? You would have had 90,000 years of humans being able to procreate and expand their numbers, right? And that would have happened, and that should have happened. What we don't find is we do not find humans operating on that level ever. We don't find it. So what that tells us, it tells us that human society, or humans in the sense that we know them now, did not probably exist 100,000 years ago. Now, I am not going to don't shut this off thinking I'm going to say, oh, God created us 6,000 years ago. Not at all. It's nothing to do with God, nothing to do with any of that. It is just an interesting point of contention that once we look at the evidence and we follow the science and we look at our current situation and apply those critical thinking skills, we can deduce the possibility that humans, in the sense that we know them now, are really not that old at all. Right? The archaeology definitely supports that. The psychology supports that. The current situation we find ourselves supports that, right? We can look around right now and use what we have going on now as scientific evidence for what happens when humans get out of control population-wise. Or at least what we would call out of control right now, resource-wise. Whatever. I'm not advocating anything. I'm just saying this is a scientific observation of what is going on in society right now that a lot of people don't want to admit to. But here we are. And everybody's suffering from it, by the way. Everybody has this problem, right? And what's the answer? I don't have an answer. What's even more interesting is that what the answer in the past for humans to live, maybe a better, healthier life was literally humans being wiped off of the planet en masse in these catastrophes, right? It's just something to think about. But in my opinion, scientifically speaking, what I think is that if we look around right now and we look at the human population as its numbers are now, and we extrapolate backwards, we can say in a scientific sense that humans had to have gone through multiple catastrophes to cleanse the numbers to bring them to where they were, given the genetic evidence. And then the catastrophes had to have stopped to let humans grow. And sure enough, we don't have catastrophes anymore, do we? So now we find ourselves facing a very interesting observation. We can now see what happens when humans are not being slapped around constantly by earth-shaking catastrophes. Humans grow exponentially. They grow fast. We now know this. This is a scientific fact. So when we look back in the past, say, 100,000 years, like what mainstream claims, that we were around for, we should also find billions and billions of people sprouting up everywhere because, according to the mainstream, catastrophism never happens, right? We cannot possibly have any of these crazy cosmic events that absolutely just destroy Earth on a global scale, right? That's what the mainstream claims. However, the evidence does not support this. We do not have the archaeological evidence for tens or hundreds of billions of people ever existing on Earth, but we should find that. We should absolutely find that if catastrophism is not real, right? We should find hundreds of billions of people's worth of garbage all over this planet. I mean, look what happens just right now with 7, 8, 9 billion people on Earth. Everywhere you go, it does not matter. You are going to find evidence of human existence. Right, and it's going to be around for a while, by the way. So we have no evidence, no physical archaeological evidence to show that humans ever were able to get to those numbers, even though in theory they should have had no problem doing so. Even more interesting, in the past 100,000 years, the reality is Earth was in an even better position biologically, or I should say environmentally in the world, right? Like the world nowadays is impoverished compared to what it was back in the day, 100,000 years ago where humans lived. Humans should have had no problems gaining just tons of resources, expanding, and leaving their mark. There is no mark left by what we should scientifically expect with respect to human population growth. So, if it's not there, that's 2 points that pop up that we have to deal with. The first point is, if we don't find evidence for humans existing where they really should have existed, if that's what mainstream wants to claim, then that means humans probably weren't there. Now, that's the first problem, and we're not dealing with that here, but it's a very interesting issue. The second problem is that if humans were like we are now, and they've existed for the past 100,000 years, we should find 100,000 years worth of evidence to support that claim. We have none of that. We have at best maybe 5, 6, 10, 12,000 years worth of human evidence, and that is all that we have. So we find ourselves in a scientific bind. Observationally, we do not have any of the historical evidence to prove the mainstream's concept of humans like us existing for the past 100,000 years. All right, so that's not there, which means why do we assume they are there? We can't do that. The dating methodology that we currently use now does not prove that either. Like that whole methodology is garbage, so that has to be discarded. Given that, that means that humans can't possibly be that old. I mean, that's the reality. We don't have proof for that level of human existence in the past. We have to admit that. Now, the next problem that we also have to admit is that if we say that humans have been only around for 10, 12, 15,000 years, and I get that this is a crazy prospect, but the science is there. What do you want from me? I can't do anything about that. The science is right there. It's just, we have to deal with it. The other thing, though, is that even at 15,000 years, let's just say 15,000 years, that means that humans still should have exponentially grown, right? The only way you could have gotten rid of humans on a scale like that to stop that exponential growth is you are required to have some form of catastrophe wipe people out, right? And that is exactly what we find our ancient ancestors talking about all of the time. Right, look around today. We have disasters nowadays all the time, but it's nothing like it was back in the past. Right, we have the occasional earthquake or a tornado or unfortunately a tsunami will smash into something, but the reality is humans are still expanding even outside of that. Even more interesting is that you can lose millions of people, I mean tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people in the span of just a few years, right? We've had wars on this planet which have literally killed hundreds of millions of people in very short periods of time, and the populations barely fluctuated. That is also a point of evidence to think about. So whatever catastrophes were hitting the Earth back in the day, these catastrophes were absolutely Earth destroying. Right? It was not little areas, because you can lose hundreds of millions of people in little areas and the rest of the planet will go on no problem. We know this for a fact, right? It's a scientific fact, right? We can see that kind of loss and still continue to explode population-wise. We have that evidence. There's nothing to argue. So to keep humans down, I guess this is the point. So humans are very tenacious when it comes to expansion. I think that's an observable scientific fact, that humans will expand no matter what. That is just what humans do. I think we can make that fact. So to stop human expansion, you need to have something pretty damn serious to get humans to step down, right? And if you have something slapping the entire planet around on a global scale, if you have huge mountains of water literally rolling over entire continents, if you have continents sinking and continents rising, you have tsunamis that just dwarf anything we have today, volcanoes, holes being ripped into the planet, etc., etc. If you have that kind of a thing going on, then you can at least obviously you can slow human population down. Doesn't stop it, which is also funny, but it definitely would have slowed it down. What we see now is that we no longer suffer catastrophes now, do we? Right? So let me finish this. I know I'm still talking. The main part now is that we can say, hey, look, those catastrophes happened back in the day. Our ancestors explain all of the events. We can apply plasma physics and new cosmology, figure out what they were talking about, and then we can see when it stops. And then once the catastrophes stop, we should then see the kind of population growth we would expect. And sure enough, that is exactly what we find. Right? So the science is there just from us looking at the current population and our current situation on this planet. This essentially proves, in and of itself, the catastrophism had to have happened to some degree. Now, I'm not saying we have all the details down yet in catastrophism. We don't. But we know for a fact that humans have only started to exponentially grow recently, and that is because humans have not been facing any sort of world-destroying situation. Basically, we can extrapolate from all of this that you have got to do something to keep humanity down, right? We know for a fact that humans have been around for thousands of years at least, right? Maybe 10, 15 thousands of years. We have enough evidence to kind of support that scientifically, right? We can say that scientifically. We can't go too much further back because don't forget our dating methods are trash, right? You know, all these scientists and mainstream scientists, they talk like these dating methods are perfect and they have it all figured out. Never forget they don't. They don't know the dates, right? And their sciences are flawed anyway. All right, did I make my point? So basically, looking around now, we know that at some point humans had to be slaughtered en masse, and now we are no longer being slaughtered en masse, and look what happens. Look what happens when humans are left to their own devices with nothing to kill us. All right, this is a good bullet point of evidence that ultimately supports the claim that catastrophism is real.